Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome United States Ambassador to the United Nations, Samantha Power, and Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and author of The Dressmaker of Khair Khana, Gail Lamond.
Thank you.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here. I know you're actually not long back from West Africa, so we were told beforehand it was safe for everybody to be here.
You're good.
Tell me, we'll start there. Tell me a little bit about that trip. And there was a famous Reuters picture of you getting your temperature taken at the airport. You know, what was the trip like, and what were you seeing on the ground in terms of what America's actually been able to do?
Yeah, well, it's actually particularly thrilling to be able to describe at least one aspect of the trip to this audience, because I think partly because journalists are staying away from the region. I mean, ironically, more away from West Africa, where if you do everything right, the risk is almost zero, then are staying away from Iraq and even Syria border areas and so forth. I mean, but because they're staying away, I'm not sure that the story of what the U.S. military is doing has been all that well told, and encourage any journalist to get over there quickly to see it, because what makes it really unusual from our daily bread in terms of foreign policy and trying to make a difference in the developing world is that we have science and we have statistics and we have data, and we can see linearly the difference that having the U.S. presence on the ground is making. And I just give one example. I flew from Monrovia with General Valesky, who's commanding the effort there now, to a place called Bong County. And now, Bong County had been a very affected Ebola area in Liberia. And U.S. helicopter could take us in. Had we had to drive, it would have taken 6-8 hours from Monrovia on crummy roads. And we get there and we meet 3 Navy microbiologists who had set up a Ebola lab 2 weeks before. Prior to their arrival, the turnaround time on Ebola tests was a week almost, between 5 to 7 days. They had to be driven often on motorcycles on these crappy roads to Monrovia. Then they had to wait because there was only one lab in the whole country. And for that week, Ebola negative and Ebola positive people were living intermingled waiting for their results, thereby creating a huge infection risk. Because of these 3 Navy guys and their little microbiology lab, one of the guys had gotten into microbiology, decided to become one because he'd read Hot Zone. So for him, it was a dream, a little boy's dream, to be looking in the microscope and actually working on such an important issue. Now the testing times are 3 to 5 hours. And 70% of the people getting tested are negative. So they just go back to their homes in their village. They might have malaria. They might need other treatment. They might have a cold. And beds are freed up then for people who are infected. So that's just an example where you can measure the turnaround time. So too, the 2,200 American troops who were there so far, building these Ebola treatment units. Initially, we had said we'd do 17 100-bed units. Now the U.S. military is turning on a dime and doing instead some 100-bed units, but also 10 beds here, 20 beds there, and really trying to adapt with the virus. So it's been a learning experience, I think, for everyone in the U.S. government on the foreign policy side. But to see how quickly our forces have learned, teaming up also with the CDC and our medics as part of the U.S. Public Health Service, who are treating now Liberian health workers. I mean, our people getting trained to put on that white PPE and be in the sweltering heat wearing, treating people for 2-3 hours at a time because it's such a difficult effort. I mean, it's really been, it's a sight to behold. And so I really hope the media can get out there, that can get conveyed. But I've never been proud, and I've seen U.S. military in action in Iraq and Bosnia and Kosovo, and just the multi-dimensional way in which we are learning on the fly how to do this. Now, the results, the most important question, are decent in Liberia. You're already seeing the infection rates level off and the rate of increase decrease. So Liberia is in a better position, much better position by virtue of this. Many more issues in Sierra Leone and Guinea, and the British military is active in Sierra Leone and doing a great job. But there are more gaps in Sierra Leone between what the British are providing and the overall need. And so we're also looking with USAID and the military, how we can support the British effort and get other countries to fill in whatever outstanding gaps exist.
A personal question first, and then back to the big picture. Were you personally concerned about any of it? And did you have to take your temperature twice a day when you got back?
I still do. In fact, had to call it in this morning, and we'll call it in tonight. I'm almost to day 21. I was at an event a couple days ago where someone came up to me and said, "You're on day 18," and I was like, "Oh, you were clearly checking before you came to this event." No, I mean, once you really become immersed in it and you know how it is transmitted, that it's not airborne, that people, who are, even people who end up having Ebola but who are asymptomatic are not going to be passing it, with such low levels of the virus in their bloodstream. We stayed out of Ebola treatment units. So I had the CDC. I went over the itinerary with the CDC and made sure, we didn't take any risks. And no, when you go, it's actually the sense of normalcy and people going about their business is very, very striking. My son, I have a 5-year-old boy, Declan, who was saying, "Mommy, don't go to the Ebola place. Don't go to the..." And I said, "Son, we got to fight the stigma. It's not the Ebola place. It's Liberia. It's amazing. Let me tell you about the history of this amazing relationship with the United States." And now he's obsessed with the Liberian flag because it looks just like the U.S. flag. And so we've opened up a whole new channel for discussion in our household. But Ebola is new to us. It's not new to some parts of Africa, but it's new to us. And so I think knowing what it is and what it isn't has been a learning process. But I think we're in a better place also here domestically. People have a better sense of where the risks are and where they aren't.
But on the big picture front, General Dempsey was here earlier saying a year ago we would not have thought that we would have U.S. military forces in West Africa looking at Ebola, would not necessarily have thought about ISIL being the main source of the fight. Are we, in too many places, is the U.S. the world's policeman? And how do you approach that question given both your background, the work you've done, and the real humanitarian efforts that you've been a part of and really championed and talked about and made a career of really trying to bring to the American public's attention?
Well, it's a great question, and we are asking an awful lot right now of our forces, and the chairman does an amazing job deciding among competing priorities and figuring out how to advise the president where to deploy our precious resources. So I would say, no, we can't be the world's policeman. There's just too much going on. I see it every day in the Security Council, whether it's Mali, Somalia, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, Darfur still
And you visited
raging.
a lot of those places.
I have,
Yeah.
Congo. I mean, in Africa alone, to be the world's policeman would drain you of the capacity to do anything else with your military. That's not what we're here to do. But I think what we've seen, I think ISIL and Ebola are really good examples of this, are the ways in which we can lead the world by making investments early and leveraging them to get other countries to step up. So I mentioned the British in Sierra Leone. No question that had the United States, that the fact that the United States had come forward and made such a large troop contribution made it easier for Prime Minister Cameron to work with his military to show up, to know we'd be doing it in parallel with one another. So too, we now have the Germans contributing refitted Lufthansa planes to medevac people who have Ebola. German officers are on the ground. Chinese medical workers have showed up ready to staff Ebola treatment units, even ones that we or the British or others build. So you see the investments being made by virtue of us taking this leadership role, and ISIL is another good example. Again, there are a number of countries now joining us in the airstrikes, joining us in equipping the Iraqi security forces, taking on the training and equipping of particular units as part of the ISF, and then the humanitarian piece of it, which also where there has to be a much better division of labor, because too often the United States ends up carrying the lion's share of the humanitarian load as well, particularly in Iraq, where countries were often very reluctant because of the earlier situation, were reluctant sometimes to pull their fair share of the humanitarian burden. I think now people understand ISIL is different because of the foreign terrorist presence within the movement and the risk that those people will come home and pose a threat to European or American or Asian citizens. That makes it different, but also just the horror show that ISIL puts in place every place that they encounter, whether it's enslaving Yazidi women or expelling Christians or forcing people to convert or mass executions. I mean, so that I think has made it, that combined with the steps that the president took and leveraged, has made it easier to build this 60-nation coalition that we now have in action.
There has been a lot of frustration from people who say that the Syrian opposition or boots on the ground in Syria that want to fight have not gotten all of the resources they've been requested. And there's this fine line between how do you vet, how do you get resources to people on the ground, and some concern that there won't be a moderate opposition left by the time that real resources get to them. How do you approach the idea of U.S. military intervention versus the whole toolkit? Because you've said there has to be something between sending in the U.S. Marines and doing nothing at all. How do you approach that question?
Well, I approach it very much under the guidance of President Obama, and his view on this is that there are major short-term challenges in Syria, no question, and the moderate opposition has lost ground in recent months, no question. That said, we have established channels with groups, with vetted groups, who got into this whole effort because they wanted to protect their families and stave off chemical attacks and barrel bomb attacks and so forth, who still espouse the vision for Syria that drove the revolution in the first place, and that these people are worthy of our support, and the DoD program will be one where those people will be filtered through, both to fight ISIL and to protect their families and their communities against the regime. So we have to invest in that long game, as it were, that enterprise, because, as the president has said, we can't have a choice between beheaders, and forced converters on the one hand, and barrel bomb users and chemical attackers on the other. Like that's not a choice that the majority of the Syrian people would choose to make. They would not choose either of those options. And so, for as long as those are the two options in a particular area, this war is going to continue because people are not going to tolerate that kind of leadership, as it were. So I think we have to invest. I would note that one of the real reasons in the last 9 months that the moderate opposition has lost ground is that it was fighting on two fronts. Right. And the damage that ISIL's ascent and its brutality did on mainly Sunni opposition groups, armed groups, and Sunni opposition civilians, it really is unspeakable. Now, because of the strikes against ISIL in Iraq and also in Syria, our hope is coupling that with the train and equip program, getting that off the ground as quickly as possible, that they'll start to get some relief from the ISIL part, that sort of two-front war, and then better be able to protect themselves against the regime. So that's the approach we're taking.
Well, you are known as being somebody who's very direct and very action-oriented. And I wonder if it's ever frustrating for you, the time lag between knowing that people need resources and the time it would actually take to get them there.
Yes, it is. It is, of course. I mean, particularly in the Syria context, because you have here a conflict that's now been going on since 2011. You have more than 7 million people displaced from their homes. And as a parent or not a parent, just to imagine what it's like to try to flee. Many families have fled multiple times. They think they find refuge in one place, and then the barrel bombs come back, and they have to go somewhere else. The countries that are neighboring Syria are really bursting at the seams in terms of the number of refugees that they've absorbed. That's causing all kinds of social tension and dislocation. So just the sheer heartbreak metric is just so high. And we have a strategy that if we can inject some new life into a political process, again, and if the moderate opposition can hold their ground and then get strengthened over time, but of course you want to help every family in the here and now. And so we do what we can on the humanitarian side as the largest donor by far to try to feed people who've been displaced and found refuge somewhere, and obviously try to work at the UN and in other venues to try to establish also some accountability for the atrocities that are being carried out.
You have talked about the post-World War II architecture that was created, and we're still living in that. And I wonder if you think that the post-World War II architecture is sufficient in a world that is on fire in any number of corners. Does reform have to happen, or are there new institutions needed? Is the world up to doing the job that is required in so many places now, including Syria?
Well, I think the first answer to that question probably is that we should each look at our national response capabilities because, at least as far as the eye can see, nation states are the foundation of the international order. Social protest movements and non-state actors in terms of civil society, but also on the nefarious side in terms of terrorist groups or whatever. They're obviously shaping events in different parts of the world in very important, in the case of terrorists, very disturbing ways. But by the same token, the response capabilities, the monopoly on force lies with the state. So Ebola is a really good example. We are building muscle memory. Every day, our military is involved in responding to an infectious disease outbreak. That's muscle memory that needs to be captured, exploited, as it were, built upon. And we need to learn the lesson, of course, of this outbreak in terms of the weakness of the health infrastructure in these three countries. The president had launched well before this outbreak, this global health security initiative. Now it's got new energy from other countries that maybe hadn't been as seized of the issue as we had been. So that's an example of, that's just on the public health and security side. But the kinds of ways we need to learn from the experiences we're having and then adapt our capabilities and then get better at pooling the capabilities to be able to respond to a crisis. Another example I'd give on the more traditional security side is peacekeeping, where I've made a real push under President Obama's leadership to both render peacekeeping missions more efficient because there are more of them and they are more and more expensive because there are so many around the world. And because there are real costs now to fortifying UN bases that used to be before the Canal Hotel attack in Baghdad, which we were talking about before we walked out here, used to be, that people could come up to UN bases, walk in and out, check their email or whatever. Can't have that anymore. So that's adding a layer of expense. So we're trying to make them more efficient, but also try to get countries that in the 1990s were involved in peacekeeping, such as those in Europe, and who got out to get back in. Because right now you have a situation where developed countries, by and large, are paying for peacekeepers, and developing countries are actually performing those missions. We also need to enhance the capabilities, and this is something where the U.S. military and our partners in Europe and elsewhere are helping. We need to deepen the capabilities of those countries that are willing to put their troops forward. So to take a couple examples, Rwanda and Ethiopia, the two largest African troop contributors. If there's a crisis in the Central African Republic and Muslims are getting targeted by Christians or Christians by Muslims, the Rwandans are usually the first to raise their hand because of their own history. And yet, they don't have the capacity to lift themselves into countries, so that's something the U.S. military often does. They don't have the capacity often to fully sustain themselves, to have the kind of logistic tail that they need in a pinch. And so if we want to support Rwanda to be a kind of regional peacekeeping force in the way that it has been and to protect civilians and to bring a new energy to peacekeeping, we've got to not only lift them in this mission or that mission, but also work toward the day where they can lift themselves and be fully self-sustaining. So the president has launched something called an African Response Partnership with 6 African militaries that are the most likely to come forward and some of the most capable militaries on the continent. And now we're seeking to pool training resources and capabilities from our European partners so that over time we could really see 6 African militaries capable of doing what we know we need them to do. And remember, where peacekeeping often is a little bit of a sidelight compared to the issues that are dealt with, by our military. But more and more, these missions are finding themselves in places that have a nexus to our national security interests, like Somalia, like Mali, even like Central African Republic, where you can already see Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab kind of checking it out in the northern part of the country to see whether there's a fertile ground to be exploited. So we have an interest in peacekeeping becoming more effective, even beyond the atrocity prevention and the civilian protection interests that we know we have.
Is there a greater role for the U.S. military to play in UN peacekeeping?
Well, already, if you take Central African Republic, which I've now mentioned a couple times, it's the U.S. that is helping build the bases that the peacekeepers are deploying to. President Obama allocated $100 million for the U.S. to train and equip those units going in. We have more than 100 military and police officers who are now sprinkled out across missions, and I really encourage those kinds of deployments, which I think, again, are of minimal risk, but just using that kind of niche capability of being a planner. You know, our planners helping the African Union with the Somalia mission, our planners helping with the Central African Republic mission, just a small deployment of a handful of guys, and you can imagine the kind of command and control ethos and the professionalism that that can inject into a mission. So we're doing a lot, actually.
Right, and you talked about lessons learned. I just want to talk about Libya for 1 second, which is, seems like it is a lesson in both the pitfalls and the real opportunities of intervention. I just wonder, what are lessons learned and how do those inform how you think about?
Well, Libya certainly is not. This morning when I got on the airplane from New York, there was hope of a ceasefire, and then just as I was coming in, it looks like that ceasefire is not holding meaningfully, at least. So Libya is in a very, very difficult state right now. You know, looking back to 2011, there was a moment where Gaddafi made very clear his intentions toward not only the people of Benghazi, but anybody who had taken up arms against him. President Obama, I think, made very much the right choice, which is to prevent what, I think, again, if we take Gaddafi at his word and look at the practices that he had employed up to that point in repressing the rebellion, could have been, you know, a horrific massacre. The intervention occurred. We got a lot of countries by our side. It was, again, U.S. leadership creating a broad coalition, so we weren't bearing the burden alone. The challenge is that there is in Libya a set of tribal dynamics that were unleashed, and very little tradition of people peacefully adjudicating their differences because of Gaddafi's form of rule. So at some point when Gaddafi left, those elements were going to be unleashed, and unfortunately we're now living, and not us, but the Libyan people are having to live in that environment. Again, I think there's too much, oh, look, this is what intervention has wrought. Right. I mean, you know, if you take a case where if you look at Syria today, right, where the people rose up and the government decided to repress the rebellion in earnest, you know, that's not also a model society. In other words, things are extremely difficult there, excruciatingly difficult for civilians in Syria. So I think one has to be careful about overdrawing lessons or ascribing to one particular action a whole set of consequences that ensue. Because when leaders repress their people and indeed set out to massacre them, it's not like the people go away, right? Once those sentiments have been unleashed and they're looking to claim agency for their children, it's very hard to put that back in the box. And so that's where the Tunisia model, which is not a model, sadly, that a lot of governments in the Middle East have taken, but has been a much more stable one, because trying to maintain a social compact, however unwieldy it is a better route to getting the kind of stability and democracy they're seeking.
Just the last question as we wrap up. You gave a really moving speech in 2013 about how skepticism about foreign intervention is really important, but that, you know, I wonder, I guess, to push you on that, have we overlearned the lessons from Iraq, where, you know, we don't, you know, the American public is tired and is sort of worried about anything that even resembles an intervention, whether it's humanitarian or on the military side?
Well, again, I have sympathy for the public, given the number of lives, American lives, that have been lost in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the kind of sacrifices that the families of service members have made, just tour after tour after tour. And I can only imagine what it's like, you know, to be a spouse in a family like that, and the challenges. So that's just on the service member side, and then the public generally, you know, seeing a lot of resources expended. So I think, as I said, I think probably in that speech, there's a healthy skepticism, and the risks of using military force are so significant for our men and women, for the individuals in the country in question. There are so many unpredictable consequences when you use force that there should be a lot of layers and a lot of checks and balances. At the same time, there are really profound threats to our national security that exist on the global stage today. And whether it's a movement, a terrorist movement, the first of its kind that controls territory, controlled oil fields, you know, made use of heavy weaponry. I mean, that is the kind of terrorist juggernaut that the American people understood we couldn't tolerate. We couldn't see just continuing to execute and convert their way through the Middle East. You know, not every American they encountered vulnerable to their wrath. And so I think the support notwithstanding the fatigue, notwithstanding the drain of this long enterprise, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, you see support for a mission that the United States and the American people know, is necessary for our national interest. I think one of the reasons you see support is because we've also mobilized other countries. I think when the American people see, and I've heard this a lot from both sides of the aisle up on Capitol Hill as we've engaged on ISIL and on Ebola, is they really want to see, well, what's everyone else doing? When we show up, okay, that's one thing, we get it, we've got to lead, we're America, and we want to lead. But people don't like the free rider problem in the international system. And so that's where I have the perfect job, because that's my day job, is to try to break through the free rider problem, the collective action challenges, and get countries to step up with us.
Ambassador Power, thank you for your time.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.